There is a bridge in the northern part of this state that crosses a creek nobody fishes anymore. And there is a gravel pull-off on the east side of that bridge that isn't marked on any map. And for 19 years, I drove a bus past it twice a day. And I'm going to tell you what happened there, because I have spent 10 years not telling anyone. And I'm tired in a way that I don't think sleep is going to fix. I want to be careful at the start, because the start is where I've lied to myself the most. So, I'll begin with a picture, and I'll ask you to hold it while I work my way toward it. There is a morning in February. The snow has been coming off the bay for 2 days. The county has pulled the plows back to the main roads. I come around a bend in a 1998 Bluebird that smells like diesel and the inside of an old coat. And the pull-off is on my right, and a man is standing in the middle of it. He is wearing a brown canvas coat with the hood up. His hands are in his pockets. There are 6 inches of fresh snow on the ground around him. And there are no footprints, none coming in from the road, none coming out of the trees, none around his boots. The snow on the pull-off is unbroken, except for the small, shallow circle where he is standing. And even that circle looks wrong, as if the snow has filled in around him while he waited. I open the door. He gets on. He pays an exact change. He says thank you. He sits in his usual seat. I want you to keep that picture in your head while I tell you the rest, because the rest is mostly the years I spent trying to talk myself out of it. And you are going to need to remember what I actually saw. My name doesn't matter for this. I'm 58 years old. I live alone in a rented half of a duplex about 20 miles south of where the route ran. The other half is empty most of the year. The walls are thin enough that I can hear the refrigerator on the other side when the house is quiet, and I notice that sound more than I should, because there are not many other sounds in my life to compete with it. My wife died 2 years ago. I'll get to that. I'm trying to do this in order. The route was called the North Loop. It wasn't printed on any schedule after 2004. It wasn't on the website when the website went up in 2009. It was the kind of run that existed because 3 or 4 people needed it, and because nobody at the transit authority wanted to be the one who took it off the board. My name was on the assignment sheet for that route from the spring of 2001 until the winter I retired. And even now, sitting at this kitchen table with my coffee going cold, I can feel the steering wheel under my left hand, worn smooth on the inside curve. A small chip near the horn pad from where I dropped a thermos in 2007. The thermos was a gift from Carol on our 10th anniversary. I kept using it after the dent because the dent didn't affect the coffee, and because Carol had given it to me, and because most of the things in my life were like that, kept and used because the alternative was a decision I didn't want to make. The loop started at a park and ride off M72 and went north, then northeast, on a chain of county roads that most people in the area couldn't name in order. There were 7 listed stops and 2 unlisted. One was a turnout near a closed bait shop. The other was the pull-off near the bridge I just described. And I want to come back to that bridge now, because I think it's important that you understand what kind of place it was before anyone got on the bus there. The creek under the bridge ran out of state land to the east and dropped into a swampy stretch to the west. It froze every November and didn't fully thaw until April. The bridge itself was a low concrete span that the county had patched so many times that the seams in the deck made a particular 3-beat sound when the rear tires went over it. I used to count those beats out of habit. The pull-off on the east side was big enough for maybe 2 trucks. There was a logging 2-track that ran east from it into state land, and there was the creek, and there was a stand of jack pine that had been planted in rows after a fire in the 70s and had grown up looking like a place that didn't want company. The whole approach to the bridge, from a quarter mile out in either direction, was the kind of stretch where you naturally let off the gas. because the trees came close to the shoulder and the light through them did something strange, even at midday. A kind of dimming that you didn't notice until you came out the other side and your eyes had to readjust. In the 14 years I'd been driving the route before any of this started, I'd stopped at that pull-off maybe twice. Both times, it had been hunters who had flagged me down and seemed embarrassed about it. The pull-off wasn't near anything. There was no house east of it on the county map. There was no road that led to a house. The 2-track went into the pines, and according to the plat books at the county office, ended at the corner of an old inn holding that hadn't had a tax address on it since the early 80s. I'll tell you how I know about the plat books later. I want you to know that I didn't look at the plat books for innocent reasons. The riders on the loop, when there were riders, were quiet. That was one of the things I liked about the route. I'd driven a city run in Traverse for 2 years before I bid into the rural routes. And the city run had been full of people who needed to be heard, which is its own kind of exhausting. On the North Loop, people got on, nodded, sat down, looked out the window, and got off where they were going. There was a man named Earl who rode every Tuesday and Friday for about 11 years to a dialysis appointment and back. He was a retired millwright with a careful, formal way of speaking. And he and I had developed the kind of friendship that requires almost no talking. He would nod when he got on. He would nod when he got off. Once a year, around the holidays, he would press a folded $20 bill into my hand and refuse to take it back. And I would put it in the donation jar at the senior center on his behalf, because I knew he would have preferred that to my keeping it. There was a woman I only ever knew as Mrs. Hales, who got on at the second-to-last listed stop with 2 grocery bags and got off at the bait shop turnout and walked somewhere I never saw. She wore the same dark green wool coat in every season, cold enough for a coat, and a kerchief over her hair. And she carried her bags the way women of a certain generation carry bags. Balanced, deliberate, as if the bags were doing some of the work of holding her upright. There was a high school girl named Marcy who wrote in for an after-school job at a diner that closed in 2013. There was a man named Roy who worked at the gravel pit for a season and then stopped riding without explanation. There was a couple in their 60s who rode together every other Wednesday for a year and then stopped. And a year after that, I read in the obituaries that the husband had died. And I never saw the wife on the bus again. And I've thought about her on and off ever since. I'm telling you about these people because I want you to understand what it meant when somebody started riding who didn't fit. The route had a shape. The shape was made out of people who rode it for visible reasons, to visible places, with visible lives that I could imagine without too much effort. When the shape changed, I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, in the small bones around your ears, before you have words for what's coming. He first got on in the fall of, I want to say 2014, a Thursday in October. I almost didn't stop. I saw him standing in the pull-off in the brown canvas coat with his hands in his pockets and his hood up. And my first thought was that he was waiting for someone in a truck. I slowed down because that's what you do. And he stepped forward, and I opened the door. And he got on and paid an exact change and sat down 4 rows back on the right side. He said, "Thank you." I said, "You're welcome." He rode to the end of the route at a closed gas station, and he rode back. And he got off at the pull-off and walked east on the 2-track until the jack pines closed around him. I want to be honest about something. Because if I'm not honest about it now, the rest of this won't make sense. From the first time he got on the bus, I had a feeling about him, not fear, not suspicion in any sharp sense. It was the feeling you get when a detail doesn't fit the picture and your mind keeps trying to put it back. He didn't smell like the woods, which is what you'd expect from a man who had walked out to a pull-off in October. He smelled faintly of laundry detergent and, underneath that, of something medicinal that I couldn't place. His boots were clean. The soles weren't worn the way a walker's soles get worn. His hands, when he handed me the fare, were soft. The fingernails were trimmed. He wasn't a logger or a hunter or a man who had walked any meaningful distance through brush. He had been dropped off, or he had come from a vehicle parked out of sight, or he had walked from somewhere I couldn't picture from the inside of the bus. I didn't ask. That was the first small silence. It seemed like a polite silence at the time. It almost always does. He was on the bus again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after, and then twice a week through November, then 3 times a week into December. He always paid in exact change. He always said thank you. He always sat in the same seat. He never spoke to the other regulars, and they never spoke to him, which was not unusual on that route, but felt, after a while, like something more deliberate than custom. Earl, who would nod at anyone, did not nod at him. Mrs. Hales, who took her seat 1 row in front of him on Tuesdays, sat with her shoulders turned slightly toward the window in a way she didn't sit on other days. I noticed these things. I didn't do anything with them. I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to actually think about it for a second rather than letting it pass. If you'd been driving that bus in the fall of that year, after the 3rd or 4th time he got on, would you have asked? Just a friendly question. Where are you headed? What brings you out this way? Most people I've told a softer version of this to have said that they would have asked. I believe them when they say it. I also think most of them are wrong about themselves, the way I was wrong about myself. Because asking is a small act with a large cost, and the cost is that you have to do something with the answer. I didn't want an answer. I wanted the route to keep being the route. There were other things in those first months that I noticed and set aside. In late October, on a clear afternoon, I came around the bend, and he was standing in the pull-off, and the sun was low behind the pines, and his shadow on the gravel was not the same length as the shadows of the trees beside him. It was shorter. I looked twice. I told myself the light through the branches was breaking things up, that you couldn't trust shadows in pine country, that the eye does what it wants late in the day. I opened the door. He got on. He sat in his seat. In November, on a Friday, I came over the bridge and he was already on the shoulder, walking north in the same direction I was driving, about 30 yards past the pull-off. He didn't turn around when he heard the bus. He didn't wave. I slowed down and pulled even with him and opened the door. And he stepped up onto the bus without breaking a stride, as if he had been expecting me to be exactly there at exactly that moment, which I realized later he had been. He paid. He said thank you. He sat in his seat. I drove the loop. He got off at the pull-off on the way back and walked east, and the light by then was the color of old pewter, and the pines took him in the way pines do. In early December, the first hard snow came in overnight, and I was the first vehicle through that stretch in the morning. The county hadn't plowed yet. There were no tire tracks on the bridge. There were no tire tracks in the pull-off. He was standing in the middle of it, and the snow around him was clean. I told myself a plow had come through and turned around at the pull-off and pushed the snow smooth, and that he had walked in along the swept track, and that I had simply missed the place where his prints came in. I told myself this for the rest of the loop. I told myself this all the way home. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had almost convinced myself. Almost. There's that word again. I'd like to say I've stopped using it. I haven't. I want to tell you about the February morning now, the one I started with. because I've put it off long enough. It had snowed for 2 days, the kind of lake effect run that comes off the bay and doesn't let up. And the county had pulled the plows back to the main roads. The North Loop was technically a snow route, meaning we ran it unless dispatch said otherwise, and dispatch hadn't said otherwise, so I ran it. There was nobody at the first 3 stops. Earl wasn't going to dialysis that day. I knew because his daughter had called the office. Mrs. Hales didn't ride in winter past Christmas. I drove the loop in low gear with the heater on full, and the wipers struggling, and the radio off. And the silence inside the bus was a particular kind of silence that anyone who has driven alone in heavy snow will recognize. It was a silence that felt like it was waiting for something. When I came around the bend toward the bridge, my hands were already tightening on the wheel. I had been doing that without noticing for weeks, and that morning I noticed he was standing in the middle of the pull-off. There were no tire tracks. There were no boot prints. There were no marks of any kind on the snow except the shallow circle where he stood. And the circle was so shallow it could not have been made by a man who had walked there an hour ago, let alone someone who had stood waiting for the bus on a county schedule he could not have known in any precise way, because that schedule had not been printed anywhere since 2004. I opened the door. He got on. He paid in exact change. He said thank you. He sat in his seat. I drove the rest of the loop without looking at him in the mirror, which is to say, I made a decision not to. When I got to the turnaround at the closed gas station, I sat there for a long minute with the engine idling and the heater blowing, and I tried to think of a reasonable explanation. A truck had dropped him off and driven away before I came around the bend, and the wind had filled in the tracks. He had walked in along the creek bed, where the snow was thinner under the bridge. He had come down the 2-track from somewhere east, and the wind had blown the snow smooth behind him in the field. Any of these were possible. None of them were quite right, but any of them were good enough to keep driving, and I kept driving. On the way back, I looked at him in the mirror once. He was looking out the window at the trees. His face, what I could see of it under the hood, was calm in a way that I would later describe to myself as untroubled, which is a word I chose because it was less alarming than the words I might have chosen. He got off at the pull-off and walked east on the 2-track, and the new snow took his footprints and held them. And I drove home and didn't tell Carol about it. I should have mentioned her before now. Her name was Carol. We had been married 22 years at that point. We didn't have children, which had been a sorrow for a long time, and then it stopped being a sorrow in the way that some sorrows do, by becoming furniture. She worked at the hospital in the billing office. She liked crossword puzzles and the kind of mystery novels where the detective has a cat. She knew I drove a route most people didn't know existed, and she had asked me about it in the early years with real interest, and I had given her real answers. By the winter I'm telling you about, she didn't ask anymore, and I didn't volunteer, and neither of us thought of this as a problem, because we were comfortable. And comfort is what most people are aiming for. And most people would have said we had it. The night of the snow morning, I came home, and she had made a pot roast, and we ate it at the kitchen table, and she told me about a coworker whose son had been accepted to a school downstate. And I nodded in the right places and made the right sounds. And at one point, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me and said, "You all right?" I said I was. She watched me for a second longer, and then she went back to what she had been saying. That was the first time, I think, that she noticed something. I'd been doing this work long enough to know that the first time someone notices something is almost never the time they say anything about it. They just remember it. They file it. They wait to see whether it happens again. That winter, there were a number of things I noticed and set aside. I started counting the seams on the bridge. I'd been driving over them for 14 years, and there were 3. That winter, there were 3 until late January, and then one week there were 4. And I told myself the county had patched a new crack. I never confirmed this. I never looked. I just counted every day, and tried not to mind that the count had changed. I started smelling the medicinal smell on the bus after he got off. Not on his seat when I checked it. In the aisle, faintly, like someone had walked past a bottle of something in a closed room. It would linger for a stop or two, and then it would go. I started losing time on the loop. Nothing I could put a number on. I would pull into the park and ride at the end of my shift and look at the clock and feel, faintly, that I had arrived 3 or 4 minutes later than the route should have taken, even though I had driven it the way I always drove it. Once I checked my watch against the dispatch log. The numbers matched. The feeling didn't go away. If you've ever had a job where the rhythm of it is so deep in your body that you can feel a deviation before you can name it, you'll know what I'm describing. If you haven't, I'm not sure I can explain it any other way than to say that for the first time in 14 years, the loop was no longer mine. Something else was using it. I didn't know what. I didn't want to know. In March, the snow started to give. The creek under the bridge was still frozen, but the edges had begun to darken. He kept riding. The other regulars kept riding. The loop kept being the loop. And then on a Tuesday morning at the second-to-last listed stop, Mrs. Hales got on with her 2 grocery bags and said good morning to me, which she had never done in 11 years. And then she said, "That man." I want to give her the full sentence as she said it. She said, "That man, at the bridge, I don't think you should let him on anymore." I said, "Ma'am." She said, "I've seen him out there. I walk that way sometimes. There's no house. There's nothing out there. I don't know where he comes from." She said, "My sister-in-law used to live off County Road 612, and she said there were some folks who had a cabin back in those pines in the 70s. She said they left in a hurry one fall. She didn't know why. She said the cabin burned down a year later, and nobody rebuilt it, and the land got tangled up in a tax thing, and she always thought it was a strange piece of ground. She said it without alarm. She said it the way you'd tell someone they had a taillight out. She said it, and then she sat down in her usual seat and looked out the window and didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride. When she got off at the bait shop turnout with her 2 grocery bags, she didn't look at me. I drove on. I came to the pull-off. He was standing there. I opened the door. He got on. He paid an exact change. He said thank you. He sat in his seat. I had a choice in that moment that I want to be precise about, because the choice was smaller than it sounds. And I think people make this kind of choice many times in their lives without recognizing it as a choice at all. I could have said something. I could have said, "Sir, can I ask where you're walking from?" I could have said, "Sir, one of my regulars has expressed some concern." I could have said anything. I said nothing. I closed the door. I drove the loop. That's the moment, if there is a moment. I have spent 10 years trying to find an earlier one, a cleaner one, a more dramatic one, and I haven't been able to. The moment was the closing of the door and the not saying. Everything after that was just consequence. 3 days after Mrs. Hales spoke to me, I drove the loop and the pull-off was empty. He wasn't there. I felt a relief that surprised me with its size, and I told myself the relief was about the weather, or about being tired, or about the cup of coffee waiting for me in the thermos with the dent. 5 days after that, the pull-off was still empty, and the relief was beginning to take on a different shape. By the end of the second week, I was no longer telling myself anything about the relief at all. On a Wednesday in early April, I came around the bend, and there were 3 sheriff's vehicles in the pull-off. Their lights weren't on. There was yellow tape across the entrance to the 2-track. A deputy I knew slightly, a man named Vern, who had ridden the bus once when his cruiser was in the shop, waved me down. I rolled to a stop and opened the door. He stepped up onto the bottom step and asked me if I'd ever picked up anyone at this pull-off. He asked it casually, the way you'd ask if I'd seen a particular dog. I said yes. I said there was a man who rode pretty regularly from this stop. I described him more or less accurately, although I left out the laundry detergent and the soft hands and the medicinal smell, because those details suddenly seemed like things that would require explanation. Vern nodded. He asked me when I'd last seen him. I told him. He asked me whether the man had ever told me his name or where he lived or where he was going. I said no. Vern nodded again. He asked me whether I had ever asked. I said no. He didn't make a face when I said it. He just wrote something down in a small notebook. He said, "If you see him today, would you mind not picking him up and giving us a call?" He gave me a card. He stepped down off the bus. I drove on. I want to slow down here, because what I'm about to describe is the part of the story I have worked hardest to keep from myself, and I owe it the time. For about a week, I drove the route as if nothing had happened. I came around the bend each day with my hands tightening on the wheel the way they always had. And each day the pull-off was empty. And each day I drove on. The yellow tape came down on the 3rd day. The sheriff's vehicle stopped being there on the 4th. On the 7th day, I came around the bend, and there was a young woman standing in the pull-off. She was wearing a parka 2 sizes too big and jeans and boots that were not made for the woods. She was maybe 25. She had a backpack on one shoulder. She stepped forward when I slowed down, the way he had stepped forward, and I opened the door. She didn't pay. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at me and said, "Are you the driver who picks up here?" I said I was the driver who drove this route. She said, "My brother rode this bus." She said his name. It was a common name, and I'm not going to give it to you, because the family deserves the dignity of not being identifiable in a story I'm telling for my own reasons. She said, "My brother has been missing since the 12th. She said, "Do you remember picking him up?" I said I did. She asked where he got on. I told her. She asked where he got off. I told her. She asked if he had ever said anything to me. I said no, only thank you. She asked if I'd ever asked him anything. And here is where I lied, and the lie was so small that I didn't recognize it as a lie until much later. I said no, he didn't seem to want to talk, which was true as far as it went. The lie was in what I didn't say, which was that I had never asked him anything because I had not wanted to know. She looked at me for a long moment. I have thought a great deal about that look. It was an accusation. It was something worse than accusation. It was the look of a person who has been given an answer that confirms a thing she had already begun to suspect, and who does not have the energy left to make the answer matter. She said thank you. She got off the bus. She walked east on the 2-track until the pines closed around her, and I sat there with the door open for longer than I should have. And then I closed the door and drove the loop. That night, I told Carol. I told her a version of it. I told her that a young man who had been riding the bus had gone missing, and that the sheriff had asked some questions, and that the man's sister had come looking for information. I didn't tell her about Mrs. Hales. I didn't tell her about the snow in February with no footprints. I didn't tell her that I had felt relief when the pull-off was empty. Carol listened the way she listened to anything I told her about the route, which was with a kind of gentle, distant attention. She asked if I was all right. I said I was. She made tea. We watched a show about a baker in England. We went to bed. I want to be careful with what I say next, because the temptation in a story like this is to make the consequence dramatic. The consequence wasn't dramatic. It was slow, and it was domestic, and it was the kind of thing that doesn't show up in any official record because it didn't break any rules. A week after the sister, Vern came back. Not to the pull-off, to the bus barn. He found me at the end of my shift, sitting at the small desk in the corner where the drivers do their paperwork. And he sat down on the metal folding chair across from me and put his hat on his knee. He said, "I wanted to ask you a couple more things, off the record." He said, "The man your sister came looking for." He said, "Did he ever look like he was hurt? Did he ever seem confused? Did he ever seem like he might be in some kind of trouble?" I thought about it longer than I would have if I hadn't been thinking about it for weeks already. I said no. I said he had seemed calm. Vern nodded. He said, "The family has been making the rounds. They've put up some posters in town." He said his sister has been driving out to the pull-off on her own. He said it without judgment, but with the particular care of a man who is telling you that someone is doing something that worries him. He said, "If you see her out there, would you mind giving me a call?" I said I would. He stood up. He picked up his hat. At the door of the office, he paused and said, "You sure there isn't anything else?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." He nodded once and left. I don't know why I'm telling you that the way I'm telling you. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I had another chance. There was a chair, and there was a man, and there was a question, and I had a name for what I had not done, and I did not say it. I'm going to keep being honest about this for as long as I can stand it, because the only thing worse than what I did is pretending now that I didn't have opportunities to undo it. Through the rest of that spring, things happened at a pace that I think is worth describing carefully, because I've come to believe the pace was the point. Missing posters went up in town, not many, a handful. The grocery store had one on the corkboard by the entrance, between a notice for a lost dog and an ad for piano lessons. The library had one taped to the inside of the door. The hardware store had one on the bulletin board by the register. And the man at the register, a tall man named Bill, who had known me since I was 30, watched me look at it once and didn't say anything. I want to be clear that nobody in town looked at me differently. The man had been riding a bus on a route most people didn't know existed. He had gotten on at a stop nobody used. His sister was a stranger who had come up from somewhere downstate. The town's attention turned to the poster for about a month, and then it turned to other things, the way a town's attention does. And the poster at the grocery store got covered up by an ad for a Memorial Day chicken dinner. And the poster at the library curled at the edges. And the poster at the hardware store was eventually replaced by a flyer for a tractor pull. The not noticing was, in its way, a kind of mercy I did not deserve. In May, on a slow Friday, a man got on at the second listed stop and rode all the way to the bridge before he asked me, quietly, whether this was the bus the missing fellow had been on. I said it was. He said I figured. He said he'd grown up in the area and had heard some things about that pull-off over the years. I asked him what kind of things. He said, the way people talk. He said his uncle had told him once that hunters who went into the state land east of the bridge sometimes came out turned around, that they would walk in straight and come out at a different 2-track a mile north, and that the compasses didn't always behave the way they should in there. He said it the way men in this part of the state say these things, half embarrassed, half not. He said, of course, his uncle had been a drinker. He got off at the bridge stop, which surprised me, and walked west along the road toward town. And I drove on. And when I came back through on the return trip, he was gone. and I didn't see him again. In late May, I came around the bend one morning, and the yellow tape that had been taken down weeks earlier was back. There was one sheriff's vehicle in the pull-off. The deputy in it was not Vern. He was a younger man I didn't know. He waved me past. I drove the loop. On the way back, the vehicle was gone, and the tape was gone, and there was no sign that either had been there, and I never learned what had brought them out, and I never asked. And I add this to the long list of things I never asked. In June, Mrs. Hales stopped writing without explanation. I called the office to ask if anyone knew anything, and the woman who answered the phone said Mrs. Hales had gone to live with a son in Grand Rapids. I asked when. She said about 2 weeks ago. I asked if Mrs. Hales had left any kind of message for me. The woman said no. I said thank you. I hung up. I sat in the bus barn office for a while with my hand on the phone, and I felt, for the first time, the weight of all the things I had not said pressing up against me from inside, like a held breath. Through the summer, I started doing things I wouldn't have been able to explain if anyone had asked. I started, on days off, driving past the pull-off in my own truck. I would drive past it slowly, and then keep going for a mile, and turn around, and drive past it again. I did this maybe 8 times over the summer. I never stopped. I never got out. I never walked east on the 2-track. I just drove past, and looked, and kept going. If you've ever found yourself doing something repeatedly that you wouldn't be able to explain, if someone asked, I think you understand the texture of what I'm describing. It wasn't a search. It was something more like a check-in, as if I were confirming over and over that the place was still empty, and that the emptiness was, in some way I couldn't quite articulate, my doing. I started going to the county clerk's office during my lunch break. I would tell myself I was running an errand. I would buy a sandwich at the deli across the street and bring it with me, so that if anyone asked, I could say I had just stopped in to eat in the lobby. Nobody asked. I would sit in the lobby for 15 minutes, pretending to read the bulletin board, and then I would go to the records room and ask the woman at the desk for the plat book for the township east of the bridge. She would hand it to me without comment. I would sit at a table by the window and flip through it until I found the in holding. It was marked with a small rectangle and a parcel number and the words, Last Assessed 1983. The owner of record was a name I didn't recognize. I looked it up in the property tax rolls. The taxes hadn't been paid since 1989. I looked up the name in the obituaries archived at the library. I found one from 1991. A woman in her 70s. No mention of children. No mention of a husband. No mention of any of the people I had been picturing. I want to be honest about why I was doing this. I was not trying to solve anything. I was trying to assemble enough small facts that I could tell myself I was being responsible without ever having to walk anywhere or call anyone. I was making a record I could point to in my own head that would let me sleep. It almost worked. It worked for about a month. Then I started dreaming. The dreams were not what you might think. They were not graphic. They were not violent. I dreamed about driving the bus. I would dream that I was driving the loop, and that I was alone, and that the bridge was longer than it should be, and that I would drive across it for what felt like a quarter mile, listening to the 3-beat sound of the seams, and that when I finally came off the bridge, the pull-off would be on my right, and the pull-off would be the size of a parking lot. There would be people standing in it, not many, 6 or 7. They would all be in the same kind of stillness. They would not be waving. They would not be looking at me. They would be facing east, toward the 2-track, and they would be waiting. The nights, I would not stop. I would drive past them. And then, in the dream, I would look in the mirror, and the pull-off would be empty. I had this dream, or a version of it, 2 or 3 times a week for the rest of that summer and into the fall. I didn't tell Carol. I didn't tell anyone. I started keeping the radio off in the truck. I started reading less at night. I would come home and sit in the driveway for a few minutes before coming inside. One evening, Carol came out to the porch and watched me sit there. And when I finally came in, she didn't ask what I'd been doing. She just said, "Supper's warm," and went back to the kitchen. And I understood, in a way I hadn't a year before, that the absence of her question was a kindness I didn't deserve. How long does silence stay harmless? I have thought about that question for 10 years. I don't have an answer. I have a suspicion, which is that silence is never harmless, that it only seems harmless for a while, and that the seeming is the dangerous part. I'd be curious whether you'd say the same. I know most people would say no, that silence is sometimes the right choice, that not every observation needs to be voiced. I would have said that too, when I was younger. I am no longer sure I believe it. In September, about 5 months after the sister came looking, I did something I haven't told anyone before now. I drove out to the pull-off on a Sunday afternoon in my own truck. I parked it on the shoulder, not in the pull-off itself, because I didn't want anyone driving by to see my truck in the pull-off, which is the kind of small precaution that should have told me something about what I was doing. I got out. I walked east on the 2-track. The light through the pines was the dim, broken light I had been driving past for 15 years without ever walking under. The air was cooler in there than it had been on the road by maybe 5 degrees, and the smell was the particular smell of jack pine duff, sharp and dry, with a thread of something colder underneath it. The 2-track went into the trees for maybe a 1/4 mile. I passed a culvert with a rusted pipe running under it. I passed a length of rotted log that someone had laid across a wet spot as a makeshift bridge a long time ago. I passed a tree with an old blaze on it. The bark grown back around the cut so that the blaze looked like a closed eye. The 2-track opened into a clearing I hadn't been able to see from the road. There was a foundation in the clearing. Concrete blocks, about 3 courses high, in a rectangle maybe 20 feet by 30. The interior was full of brush and small saplings. There was no wood, no roof, no sign that there had ever been a house standing on the foundation in living memory, except that I remembered what Mrs. Hales had said about a cabin that had burned in the 70s. And I thought, this is what's left of that. At the back corner of the foundation, there was a depression in the ground, roughly circular, about 4 feet across. It was full of dead leaves. The leaves were dry on top and darker underneath, the way leaves are when they have been collecting for a while. I stood at the edge of it for a long time. I did not look inside it closely. I did not bend down. I did not move the leaves. I stood at the edge of it, and I looked at the foundation, and I looked at the pines, and I listened. And I heard nothing except the wind in the upper branches, and very faintly, the creak behind me. And once, for a fraction of a second, what might have been a piece of cloth moving somewhere just out of sight. Although when I turned toward the sound, there was nothing. And the wind was steady, and the pines were doing what pines do. I noticed then, on the ground near the edge of the foundation, a small object I had almost missed. A button, brown, plastic, the kind that comes off a canvas coat. It was half pressed into the dirt. It had been there long enough for the rain to have settled it, but not long enough for moss to have begun to grow over it. I did not pick it up. I looked at it for about a minute, and then I looked away. And then I walked back to my truck without looking at it again, and I drove home. I did not tell anyone. I did not tell Carol. I did not call Vern. I did not drive back. I told myself on the way home that what I had seen was nothing. A foundation from an old cabin. A depression that was probably an old root cellar, or an old well, or a place where an animal had dug. A button that could have been there for years, from any one of a dozen visitors, hunters, surveyors, the man himself on some earlier walk in. I told myself that the sheriff had presumably already searched the area, and that if there had been anything to find, they would have found it. I told myself a number of reasonable things, and by the time I pulled into our driveway, I had almost convinced myself that the trip had not mattered. Almost. That night, I lay in bed and listened to Carol breathe, and to the refrigerator cycle, and to a car go by on the road outside. And I thought about the button. I thought about the leaves. I thought about the small sound I had heard out by the foundation that might have been cloth and might have been nothing. I told myself, if it had been cloth, if it had been anything, I would have gone back. I told myself this in the dark, with my eyes open, and I knew it was not true. And I went to sleep eventually, and I did not dream that night, or I did not remember dreaming, which I have learned is not the same thing. The winter after the sister came looking, I started having trouble sleeping. Not in a dramatic way. I would sleep 4 or 5 hours and then wake up at 3 in the morning and lie in bed and listen to the house. Carol would breathe beside me. The refrigerator would cycle on and off. The furnace would kick in. I would think about the pull-off. I would think about the foundation. I would think about the depression at the back corner and the leaves in it and the button. And I would tell myself, again, the reasonable things, and the reasonable things would hold until about 4:30, when they would stop holding, and I would get up and make coffee and sit in the kitchen until it was time to go to work. Carol asked me once, around this time, if I was thinking about retirement. She asked it gently. She said, "You've been with the county a long time." I said I had. She said, "You could take it any time, you know?" I said I knew. We didn't talk about it again for a while. She had seen something in me, I think, that I hadn't been able to see in myself. And she was offering me a way out of it without naming it. I didn't take the offer. I kept driving the road. If you've been with me this far, I want to say that I appreciate the patience, and I want you to know that I am aware the story has not done what stories are supposed to do. There has been no body. There has been no confrontation. There has been no moment where the man behind the wheel got out and walked east with a flashlight and a phone and a sense of duty. I understand the impatience. I want to ask you gently whether you've noticed how easily you've come to accept the not going in the time you've been listening. Whether the absence of action has begun to feel like the natural shape of things. Because that is what it felt like to me. That is how it works on a person. The not doing becomes the texture of the days. And after a while, the texture is the person. In the spring, almost exactly a year after the sister came, I picked up a new rider at the pull-off. He was an older man, in his 60s, wearing a tan jacket and a cap with a fishing lure embroidered on it. He flagged me down with a friendly wave. He paid in exact change. He sat 4 rows back on the right side. He rode to the end of the route and back, got off at the pull-off, and walked east on the 2-track. He smelled like aftershave and pipe tobacco. His hands were rough. He waved at me when he got off. I want to be honest about what I felt when he got off and walked east, because the honesty matters more than the comfort of the moment. I felt relieved. I felt that the pull-off was, somehow, a place where people walked east into the pines, and that this was simply what it was, and that whatever had happened to the man before him, if anything had happened, was not connected to the place, but only to the man, and that I could stop thinking about it. I felt all of this within about 30 seconds, while I was still sitting at the pull-off with the door closed and the engine idling. And then I drove the loop. And when I got home that night, I slept for the first time in months. 2 weeks later, the older man wasn't at the pull-off when I came around the bend. He wasn't there the next week either. I told myself he was a seasonal fisherman, someone who had a camp on the inn holding, someone who came up in the spring and left when the bugs got bad. I told myself this for about a month. Then, one afternoon, on my way home, I stopped at the gas station in Kalkaska, and the woman at the counter, who knew me by sight, asked me if I'd heard about the man they'd found in the woods off County Road 612. I said I hadn't. She said it had been on the news that morning. An older man, a hunter, missing since the previous fall. They had found him about a mile into the state land, off a logging 2-track. He had died of exposure, they thought. He had been there all winter. I asked her if they had said his name. She said a name. It was not a name I would have given the man in the tan jacket. But I had not known the man in the tan jacket's name. So the fact that it was not a name I recognized was not, in itself, meaningful. I asked her where exactly. She didn't know exactly. She said the news had said off County Road 612, near a creek. I paid for my gas and drove home. I want to pause here because I think this is the place where, if I am being responsible to what actually happened, I have to tell you that I don't know. I don't know if the man in the tan jacket was the man they found. I don't know if the first man was alive or dead when I last saw him. I don't know what the foundation in the clearing was, or what the depression was, or whether the leaves I didn't disturb were covering anything other than more leaves. I don't know whether the button I saw was his or someone else's, or older than any of it. I have spent 10 years not knowing, and I have spent 10 years choosing not to find out. And the choosing has, I think, become a more important fact about me than any of the things I might have learned. I want to add one more piece, which I have not told you yet because I was not sure I was going to. About a month after I read the obituary in the paper about the hunter, I was at the county clerk's office one more time, looking at the plat book one more time. And the woman at the desk, the one who had handed it to me without comment for months, looked up at me as I was leaving and said, "You know, you're not the only one who comes in here asking about that parcel." I stopped. I said, "Oh." She said, "A couple of folks have been in, family, I think, looking for the same thing." She said, "I just thought you should know." I said, "Thank you." I left. I did not go back. I have wondered since whether she was telling me as a kindness or as a warning. I have wondered whether the other folks were the sister or somebody else's sister or somebody else's something. I have not gone back to find out. A lot of stories about a man like me, doing a job like mine, in a place like the northern part of this state, want to end with a discovery. A walk back to the clearing with a flashlight, a call to the sheriff, a name confirmed, a weight lifted. I want to tell you the truth, which is that I never went back to the clearing. I never called Vern. I never asked the woman at the gas station for the man's name again, although I could have. I drove the route for another 3 years, and then I retired. And on my last day, I drove the loop without any riders, because it was a Saturday in November, and the regulars I had left were not the kind of people who rode on Saturdays. And when I came around the bend toward the bridge, I slowed down the way I had slowed down 10,000 times, and the pull-off was empty, and I drove on, and that was the end of my time on the route. The county discontinued the run 6 months after I retired. The new driver, a woman in her 30s named Karen, had picked up only 2 regulars in her first month, and the route was no longer financially defensible, which it hadn't been in years. But it had been defensible as long as I was the one driving it, because I'd been there a long time, and people knew me. After I left, the math of it became visible to people who hadn't been looking at the math before. And they made a decision, and the route came off the board, and the bus went to a yard in Cadillac, and somebody bought it at auction and turned it into a hunting camp. Carol died 2 years ago. I want to tell you about it briefly, because I think the shape of it matters to the shape of everything else. She was diagnosed in the spring and gone by the fall. It was fast in the way these things sometimes are. Fast enough that we didn't have the kind of long, slow conversations that people imagine they will have when they imagine this kind of loss. We had short conversations, mostly about practical things, about the house, about the bills, about who to call. In the last week, when she was mostly sleeping, she woke up one afternoon and looked at me and said, "You never told me what happened out there." I asked her what she meant. She said, "On your route. The thing that changed you." She said it without accusation. She said it the way she said most things, with a kind of gentle, distant attention. I said, "I don't know what changed me." She said, "Yes, you do." She closed her eyes. She didn't open them again that day. She died 4 days later. I have not been able to decide, in the 2 years since, whether her saying it was a gift she gave me or a thing she finally allowed herself to say after 20-some years of not saying it. And I think the answer is probably both. And I think most things in a long marriage are both. And that is something I wish I had understood earlier. I sold our house in the spring after she died. I couldn't be in it. I moved into this duplex, which I chose because it was cheap, and because the windows didn't face anything I had to look at. I spend most days reading, or walking, or driving on roads that aren't the North Loop. I drive into town for groceries on Wednesdays. I see a counselor once a month, a woman named Linda, who is patient with me and who has, more than once, gently asked me whether I would be willing to go back to the clearing. I have told her each time that I am thinking about it. I am not thinking about it. I am thinking about it, which is a different thing, and Linda, I suspect, knows the difference. I don't know how to end this, which is part of why I waited so long to say any of it out loud. I want to give you a clean answer because I think you've been generous with your time, and a clean answer would feel like a fair exchange. I don't have a clean answer. I have a foundation in a clearing that I have not walked back to in 10 years. I have a button I saw and did not pick up. I have a sister I never followed up with. I have a deputy whose card I kept in my wallet until the wallet wore out, and then I moved the card to a drawer, and then I lost track of the drawer. I have a wife who knew, and who waited, and who finally asked in a voice that didn't have the energy left for accusation. I have a route that isn't on any list anymore, and a bus that's a hunting camp, and a stretch of road I haven't driven in 5 years. I have also this. About a month ago, I was at the hardware store in town, the small one off the highway, and a man behind me in line was talking to the cashier about a piece of land he had bought up north. He said he had picked it up at a tax sale. He said it was an in-holding, surrounded by state land with no road access, and that he was going to use it for hunting. He said there was an old foundation on it, and he was thinking about clearing the brush and putting up a small cabin. The cashier asked him if he had walked the property. He said he had, twice. He said it was beautiful out there. He said there was a creek nearby. The cashier rang him up. He left. I stood in line with my bag of finish nails and my can of wood stain, and I thought about saying something to him. I thought about it for the whole time the cashier was ringing me up. I thought about asking him exactly where the property was and what he had seen when he walked it, and whether he had noticed a depression at the back corner of the foundation, full of leaves, and whether he had seen, anywhere on the ground near the foundation, a small brown button half pressed into the dirt. I thought about it all the way out to my truck. I thought about it while I was sitting in the parking lot. I thought about driving after him, because I had seen which direction he had gone, and I could have caught up. I did not say anything to him. I drove home. I put the finish nails in the drawer with the other finish nails. I put the wood stain in the basement. I made supper. I sat on the porch until it got dark. I'd like to tell you that I'm going to drive up there this spring. I'd like to tell you that I'm going to call Linda tomorrow and tell her that I've decided, that I'm ready, that I've worked something out. I'd like to tell you that this recording is the beginning of something, rather than the end of a long quiet. I'm 58 years old. I drove a bus on a route that wasn't on any list for 19 years. A man I never asked about got on at a stop where nothing existed and got off at a stop that led to a foundation in a clearing. And his sister came looking for him. And I told her almost everything I knew except the part that mattered, which was that I had not wanted to know. I have lived for 10 years with the not wanting. And the not wanting has done more to make me who I am now than anything I ever chose on purpose. There's one more thing I want to say, and then I'm going to stop. The night Carol asked me what had happened out there, after she fell asleep, I sat in the chair by her bed for a long time. The room was dark except for the light over the sink in the bathroom. I could hear her breathing, and I could hear the refrigerator in the kitchen, and I could hear a car on the road outside, far away, going somewhere I didn't know. I thought about what I would have said if I had been a different man, or if I had been the same man earlier, or if I had been brave in any of the small ways I had not been brave. I thought about the man standing in the snow with no footprints around him. I thought about the sister in the parka 2 sizes too big. I thought about the older man in the tan jacket, waving as he stepped down off the bus. I thought about the foundation, and the depression, and the leaves, and the button. I thought about all of it for a long time, and then I leaned forward, and I put my hand on Carol's hand, lightly, so I wouldn't wake her. And I sat there until the sky outside the window started to get gray. I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything then. And I didn't say anything in the 4 days that followed. And I haven't said anything until now, sitting in this rented half of a duplex with the heater clicking and the coffee gone cold. Talking into a recorder I bought last week at a store I had never been to before. The route isn't listed anywhere. The bus is a hunting camp. The man at the hardware store is going to clear the brush and put up a cabin, and walk past the depression with the leaves in it, and probably never notice it, because most people don't notice the things that other people have spent 10 years not looking at. The new owner of that land is going to make his own choices about what to see and what not to see. And those choices are going to become him, the way mine became me. And he won't know it's happening while it's happening, because that is not how it works. I'd like to think that if he ever finds something, he'll be the kind of man who says so. I'd like to think a lot of things. It's almost 5 in the morning. The light outside the window is the same gray it was the morning Carol died, and the morning I stood at the edge of the depression, and the morning I came around the bend in February with the snow blown smooth, and saw a man standing in it with no tracks around him. It's a particular gray. I've come to recognize it. I expect I'll see it again tomorrow, and the day after, and for as many days as I have left. And I don't think I'll do anything about any of the things I've told you tonight. And I would like, if you'll let me, to stop pretending otherwise. That is what I have. That is all of it. The recorder is still running. I'm going to turn it off now, and I'm going to sit here until it is light. And then I'm going to make breakfast. And then I'm going to do the things I do. And the route is going to keep not being on any list. And the clearing is going to keep being there. And I'm going to keep being the man who knows about it and does not go back. I thought, when I started talking, that saying it out loud would change something. I want to be honest with you about this, because you have stayed with me, and I owe you the last small honesty I have. It has not changed anything. It has only made the not changing audible, which is its own kind of thing, and maybe the only kind of thing I was ever going to be capable of. The heater just clicked off. The house is quiet. I can hear the refrigerator in the other half of the duplex, where nobody lives most of the year. That sound used to bother me. I have gotten used to it. I have gotten used to a lot of things. I'm going to turn the recorder off now.